Beneath the sun-scorched plains and surreal rock formations of Cappadocia lies a world few ever see, a labyrinth carved into volcanic stone, stretching deep into the earth. These underground cities weren't mere shelters. They were entire civilizations hidden below the surface. With tunnels wide enough for carts, ventilation shafts, chapels, kitchens, and escape routes, they could house tens of thousands of people for months. Built to evade invaders and survive sieges, they whisper of ingenuity, fear, and resilience. But who built them? How were they kept secret for centuries? And what mysteries still sleep in the silent chambers beneath Türkiye's ancient soil? To understand the underground cities of Cappadocia, one must first turn not to human hands, but to the raw forces of the earth itself. Long before people carved their first niches into the rock, before stories of Christians hiding from raiders or Phrygians shaping passages in fear, this land was a canvas painted by fire. Millions of years ago, in the depths of central Anatolia, titanic forces stirred. The collision of tectonic plates, the grinding of the Arabian against the Eurasian, birthed volcanoes that towered over the landscape, spewing fire and ash in eruptions so cataclysmic that they reshaped valleys and carved new horizons. The great volcanoes of Mount Erciyes, Hasan Dajai, and Melendez were not isolated peaks, but fire-breathing giants whose fury blanketed thousands of square kilometers with volcanic debris. From these eruptions came a material at once fragile and resilient: tuff. Formed from compacted ash, tuff is soft enough to be carved with simple tools, yet, when shielded from water and erosion, it holds its form for centuries. Over time, wind and rain sculpted the soft stone into surreal shapes: conical towers, jagged cliffs, and the famous fairy chimneys that the valleys of Cappadocia like natural sentinels. This strange, otherworldly landscape seemed almost destined to invite habitation, to invite humanity, to mold it as nature had done. The earliest settlers of the region were quick to recognize the peculiar gift of this stone. Unlike granite or basalt, tuff could be hollowed out without great expense of energy, yet once carved, it formed durable dwellings that kept cool in summer and warm in winter. Even small hand tools could open caves large enough for a family. For early communities seeking shelter from Anatolia's extreme climate and from the dangers of marauding invaders, this stone became not only a building material, but a refuge. Geology, then, laid the foundation for one of history's most remarkable human responses. Without the fiery convulsions of the land, there would be no underground cities. But geology alone does not explain why people moved beneath the surface, abandoning the open sky. For that, we must turn to the rhythms of history. As far back as the Hittites in the 2nd millennium BCE, Cappadocia was a crossroads of empires. Its position in central Anatolia made it both a prize and a peril. The Hittite Empire, with its capital at Hattusa to the north, controlled trade routes that stretched across Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean. The land was a thoroughfare of merchants and armies, and with each new wave of movement came uncertainty. Some scholars argue that the first crude tunnels beneath Cappadocia were cut in this era, serving as hiding places during raids. These early subterranean shelters may have been small, nothing like the sprawling complexes we know today, but they laid the groundwork for a tradition. When danger threatened, one retreated into the earth. The very nature of the volcanic tuff encouraged this instinct. Carving downward required no grand engineering knowledge, only persistence and simple tools. As communities realized the stone allowed not only shallow caves, but entire multi-level structures, they expanded. What began as chambers for families evolved into collective shelters. Over centuries, as new empires rose and fell, the Phrygians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, the instinct to burrow deeper remained. Cappadocia became a land of both surface and subsurface life, with people inhabiting the valleys and spires above ground, and using the subterranean labyrinths as a refuge below. By the time of the early Byzantine period, the geology of Cappadocia had been fully embraced as a way of life. Cave churches adorned with frescoes decorated the cliffs, monasteries were cut into rock walls, and underground cities grew ever larger. When Arab raids swept into Anatolia in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, entire populations vanished into the stone. Derinkuyu, Perhaps the most famous of Cappadocia's underground cities could house tens of thousands, complete with kitchens, wine presses, stables, wells, and ventilation shafts. The very softness of the volcanic tuff had made possible an architecture of survival. The geology also offered another gift: concealment. From above, the entrances to these subterranean realms were often invisible. Narrow shafts could be disguised as ordinary wells. Large rolling stone doors could be moved from inside, but sealed against those who did not know the trick. The land itself became a cloak, hiding the existence of whole communities from view. What began with fire and ash had transformed into a human landscape of ingenuity. The underground cities of Cappadocia were not accidents, but the culmination of thousands of years of adaptation to stone. They represent one of the rare cases in history where geology and necessity fused so perfectly that entire civilizations redefined their relationship to space. While most cultures built upward, toward towers, walls, and sky, the people of Cappadocia learned to build downward, creating a mirrored world beneath the Earth's surface. Today, as visitors descend the narrow staircases of Derinquiu or Kaymakli, brushing their hands against walls carved more than a millennium ago, they touch not only history but geology. Each groove in the stone is both a human mark and a trace of ancient volcanic fire. The underground cities are the dialogue between Earth and humanity, a dialogue written not in ink but in tunnels and chambers, a testament to how nature's violence can become the foundation of human survival. Thus, the story of Cappadocia's subterranean realms begins not with kings or empires, but with the volcanoes that shaped the land. Out of destruction came creation, out of fire came shelter. The underground cities are not merely feats of human engineering, but the inevitable answer to a question posed by the earth itself. How will you live upon, and within, a land born of fire? If Cappadocia's underground world was born of geology, it was animated by history. To understand the first tentative descent into the earth, one must look back more than 3,000 years, into the age of empires that fought and fractured across Anatolia. The earliest evidence of subterranean activity in Cappadocia may belong to the Hittites, who rose to power in the 2nd millennium BCE. The Hittite Empire, with its capital at Hattusa north of Cappadocia, was a formidable state. Builders of cyclopean walls, masters of ironworking, and diplomats who negotiated on equal footing with Egypt and Babylon. Yet even this powerful empire was not immune to threat. Rival states and migratory raiders pressed against its borders, and its heartland was often a stage for violence. It is here that archaeologists suspect the first chambers beneath Cappadocia may have been dug. The evidence is fragmentary. Narrow tunnels in the soft tuff, crude in form and seemingly lacking the sophistication of later Byzantine engineering. Yet their purpose is unmistakable: they were hiding places. Whether carved hastily in times of war or slowly expanded as precautionary shelters, these early spaces set the precedent. When danger loomed, when the horizon darkened with foreign banners, families and flocks could disappear into the earth, safe from the sword. The fall of the Hittites around 1200 BCE unleashed new instability. The so-called Sea Peoples ravaged the Mediterranean, while Anatolia fractured into smaller kingdoms. Among them were the Phrygians, who left a deeper imprint on Cappadocia. Famous in Greek tradition for their legendary king Midas, the Phrygians built rock-cut monuments across central Anatolia, their artistry proof of an intimate relationship with stone. Though they ruled centuries after the Hittites, they inherited the same geographical vulnerabilities. Open plains exposed to cavalry, valleys vulnerable to sudden raids. To the Phrygians, as to the Hittites before them, the earth itself offered refuge. They expanded the subterranean tradition, cutting deeper, experimenting with ventilation shafts, and perhaps even creating the first networks of linked rooms. Archaeologists debate whether these early underground works were continuous with the vast Byzantine complexes we see today, or whether they were abandoned and later rediscovered. The truth may lie somewhere in between. The soft tuff invited reuse. Once a chamber had been hollowed, later generations could easily expand it. Thus, Cappadocia's subterranean landscape is not the work of one people or one century, but of 1,000 hands across millennia, each adding to a growing palimpsest of survival. The importance of these early phases cannot be overstated. To retreat underground required not only practical labor, but a profound shift in the imagination. Humans are creatures of the open sky. Our myths are filled with the sun, the horizon, the vastness of stars. For the peoples of Cappadocia to invert that instinct, to turn their gaze downward into the dark, meant that necessity had bent the arc of culture. They learned to see the earth not only as a surface to tread upon, but as a vast interior space to inhabit. The earliest chambers would have been humble, small niches carved for storage, perhaps a single room to conceal a family or community elders. Yet already the principle was clear. The earth was not simply an obstacle, it was an ally. When storms of steel swept the land, stone walls above ground could crumble, but stone walls below ground endured. In time, as waves of invaders swept through Anatolia, Sumerians, Persians, Greeks, this instinct only deepened. Each incursion reminded the inhabitants of Cappadocia that security lay not in fortifications alone, but in invisibility. It is one thing to build a castle and defy an enemy. It is another to vanish entirely, leaving an invader to search empty valleys while life continued, unseen, below their feet. There is a psychological dimension here as well. To flee underground is not merely to hide, but to embrace resilience. Imagine the fear of a Phrygian mother guiding her children down a narrow passage as hoofbeats thundered above, the relief of reaching a chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, the silence broken only by breathing. In that silence, a community would rediscover its strength. These first shelters were not only defenses, but crucibles of identity, binding people together in the shared experience of survival beneath the earth. Later cultures remembered Cappadocia as a land of mystery. Greek and Roman writers spoke of its strange customs and hidden places. Strabo, the geographer of the 1st century BCE, described Cappadocia's rock-hewn dwellings. While he did not detail vast underground cities, his observations confirm a long-standing tradition of carving into the stone. By the time Rome incorporated the region into its empire, Cappadocia was already a land where surface and subsurface life blurred. This continuity is crucial. The underground cities of the Byzantine age were not sudden inventions, miraculous creations of necessity. They were the culmination of a long habit of carving, hiding, and adapting. Every chamber dug by Hittite hands, every tunnel extended by Phrygian tools, every niche shaped by Greek or Roman villagers formed the prelude to the immense subterranean labyrinths of later centuries. In many ways, these early chambers remind us of humanity's first experiments with architecture elsewhere. Just as early humans sought caves for shelter, Cappadocians learned to carve their own caves when nature provided none. The volcanic tuff offered a blank slate, pliable enough for even crude chisels. Over generations, what began as makeshift hideouts became traditions, then strategies, and finally cities. Thus, Chapter 2 of our story leaves us with a picture of beginnings, small, fragile, yet decisive. In the shadows of Hittite walls and Phrygian monuments, beneath the endless cycle of invasion and empire, people in Cappadocia turned their faces to the earth and chose a different path. They were the first to descend, and in their footsteps lay the foundation for a subterranean civilization that would outlast kingdoms, emperors, and centuries. By the time Rome stretched its imperial hand over Anatolia in the 1st century BCE, Cappadocia had already been shaped by centuries of turbulence. The Hittite Empire had long since crumbled, the Phrygians had risen and fallen, and a patchwork of kingdoms had left their traces upon the land. When Cappadocia became a client kingdom of Rome, and later a full province in 17 CE under Emperor Tiberius, the region found itself woven into the web of empire. Roads were built, taxes levied, and garrisons stationed. Yet Rome, for all its might, did not erase Cappadocia's subterranean traditions. Instead, those traditions began to intertwine with new forces that would change the character of the underground cities forever: the rise of Christianity. At first, Cappadocia under Rome seemed remote, provincial, even marginal. Its rugged terrain and volcanic valleys were far removed from the glitter of Rome or Alexandria. Yet this remoteness gave it a paradoxical importance. Empires thrive on visibility, on taxes collected, soldiers conscripted, temples attended. In Cappadocia, where the land itself invited concealment, people had learned to live in ways that eluded watchful eyes. Thus, when Christianity began its slow spread eastward from Judea, Cappadocia proved a fertile refuge. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, small Christian communities had begun to form here. Their faith was precarious, for the Roman state oscillated between toleration and persecution. When emperors demanded sacrifices to the gods, Christians refused, courting suspicion and reprisal. In Cappadocia's valleys and hidden ravines, believers carved chapels into the cliffs, their walls painted with simple symbols of fish, crosses, and shepherds. And beneath the surface, the ancient tradition of subterranean hiding places found new purpose. It is here that the underground cities began their transformation. What had once been crude shelters or storage spaces now grew into complex refuges shaped by faith. Christians fleeing soldiers or hostile neighbors could vanish into tunnels, their voices hushed in prayer, their gatherings illuminated by the glow of oil lamps. Archaeologists have uncovered chambers that may have functioned as chapels, with niches carved for altars, and long halls suitable for communal worship. To live and pray beneath the earth became not just an act of survival, but a spiritual metaphor. Just as Christ had descended into the tomb and risen again, so too did his followers retreat into the womb of the earth, awaiting deliverance. The Roman authorities, despite their infrastructure and legions, could not fully penetrate this subterranean resilience. Cappadocia was a place of porous borders and rugged landscapes, where watchtowers could overlook valleys but not trace the unseen passages below. Even if a patrol stumbled upon an entrance, the rolling of a circular stone could block pursuit. The underground cities were not fortresses in the traditional sense. They could not repel legions, but they were fortresses of absence, denying enemies the satisfaction of conquest by simply disappearing. By the 4th century, the story shifted again. Constantine's conversion in 312 CE and the subsequent Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, turning persecuted sects into a religion of empire. For Cappadocia, this transformation was profound. Its Christian communities, once huddled in caves, suddenly found themselves aligned with imperial favor. The region produced some of the early church's greatest theologians, the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. Their writings shaped doctrines of the Trinity. Their monasteries trained generations of clergy. Yet the legalization of Christianity did not render the underground obsolete. On the contrary, the subterranean cities expanded. With the empire's borders under constant pressure, Persian armies to the east, nomadic incursions from the north, the need for refuge remained. Moreover, the rise of monasticism in Cappadocia during the 4th and 5th centuries reinforced the value of retreat. Monks sought silence, austerity, and separation from worldly distractions. For them, the underground chambers provided both security and spiritual seclusion. To carve a cell into stone and live in prayerful isolation was to turn survival into ascetic devotion. The underground, then, became layered with meanings. It was a military refuge, a spiritual sanctuary, and a practical storehouse all at once. Communities learned to build granaries deep within, ensuring supplies lasted through sieges. Ventilation shafts were refined, providing airflow to sustain livestock and humans alike. Wells were sunk, connecting subterranean life to the aquifers below. The engineering grew sophisticated, and with each generation, the underground expanded like a living organism. New tunnels branching from old chambers hollowed further to accommodate growing needs. Roman Cappadocia was not a peaceful idyll. The region was a frontier, a buffer between east and west. Armies marched through, fortresses rose and fell, and the threat of war lingered. In such a world, the underground cities were no longer temporary shelters, but essential components of survival strategy. Families lived with the knowledge that at any moment, life could shift below ground for weeks or months. Children grew accustomed to flickering lamps, the muffled quiet, the feel of cool stone walls beneath their fingers. For them, subterranean life was not an aberration but part of the rhythm of existence. Even the great Roman roads, those symbols of imperial reach, could not render Cappadocia's underground irrelevant. If anything, Roads increased the threat of invasion, for they allowed armies to move swiftly across the terrain. The people responded not with resignation, but with ingenuity. They did not abandon the surface. They built upon it churches, homes, and villages, but they always maintained the shadows beneath. The underground cities became a parallel world, invisible yet always present, ready to receive their inhabitants at the first sign of danger. The transition from pagan hiding places to Christian sanctuaries reveals the adaptability of Cappadocia's people. They were not simply victims of history, cowering underground in fear. They were agents of survival, creators of spaces that blended practicality with meaning. In the darkness, they preserved their faith, their families, and their identity. When visitors today descend into Dustbound or Camocli, they marvel at the scale, corridors twisting for miles, staircases plunging into the depths, stables and kitchens carved from solid stone. Yet the story of those places begins with the small, hesitant steps of Roman-era Christians who turned survival into sanctuary, fear into faith. Their footsteps echo still, a reminder that even in the most oppressive darkness, humanity finds ways to endure, to adapt, and to transform necessity into resilience. When the Roman Empire split into East and West, Cappadocia found itself firmly within the orbit of Byzantium, the Empire of Constantinople. What had once been a provincial frontier now became a vital bulwark in the defense of Christendom's eastern borderlands. And with that transition came both new threats and new opportunities. Threats from Persian Sassanids and later Arab caliphates. Opportunities to refine and expand the underground networks that had already become essential to survival. It was in this Byzantine era, stretching from the 4th through the 12th centuries, that Cappadocia's underground cities blossomed into their most sophisticated form. The Byzantine world was one of paradox, an empire that styled itself as the continuation of Rome, yet infused with Greek language, Orthodox faith, and Eastern traditions. It was also a world under constant siege. From the east, Persian armies tested its strength. By the 7th century, the rise of Islam brought a new and powerful adversary in the form of the Arab caliphates, whose swift conquests swept across Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, pressing upon the Anatolian frontier. Cappadocia, lying directly on invasion routes, was a perpetual target. To live here was to exist in the shadow of war. Villages could be plundered, crops burned, churches desecrated. Survival meant adaptability. And so, the people of Cappadocia deepened and expanded their subterranean cities, transforming them into entire self-contained fortresses hidden beneath the earth. Archaeological studies of Dustbound, Camocli, Ozkenak, and Matsi reveal the sheer scale of this expansion. Multi-level complexes extended downward as much as 8 or 9 stories, capable of sheltering 20,000 to 30,000 people along with their animals. Narrow passageways, intentionally constricted, allowed defenders to block or ambush invaders. Circular stone doors weighing hundreds of kilograms could be rolled into place from within, effectively sealing off sections of the city. Ventilation shafts, some reaching 55 meters in depth, ensured steady airflow. Wells provided fresh water, while storage rooms stocked grain, oil, and wine. Communal kitchens, stables, and even wine presses were carved into the tuff, replicating surface life underground. But these were not mere emergency bunkers. They were spaces designed for long-term habitation. Families could survive underground for weeks, even months, while enemy armies scoured the surface. Some passages led directly from homes or churches above ground, allowing entire communities to vanish at the first alarm. To the unknowing invader, a village might seem deserted, its inhabitants fled, when in fact, hundreds of souls waited silently below their feet, safe behind stone and darkness. It was not only practical needs that shaped these underground realms. Spirituality, too, found its place beneath the earth. Byzantine Cappadocia is famous for its rock-hewn churches, exquisite chapels hollowed into cliffs, their walls covered with frescoes of Christ Pantocrator, saints, and biblical scenes. Many such sanctuaries are found underground as well. In the depths of Dustbound, archaeologists uncovered a vast hall interpreted as a church, its arched ceilings echoing the liturgical spaces above ground. For Christians in an age of uncertainty, These subterranean sanctuaries offered continuity of worship, reminding them that faith endured even in the absence of sunlight. The Arab-Byzantine wars of the 7th through 10th centuries ensured the underground cities were used often. Historical records describe repeated raids by Arab forces deep into Anatolia, sometimes reaching as far as the Black Sea. These incursions were devastating, marked by the burning of villages and enslavement of populations. Yet Cappadocia's people survived, not through direct confrontation, but through concealment. They became masters of absence. An advancing army might find little to plunder in a valley if its population and livestock had vanished below ground, its grain sealed behind stone doors. Over time, this strategy of disappearance became a cultural pattern, a collective instinct passed from generation to generation. The Byzantine state, though often strained, indirectly supported such resilience. Monasteries flourished in Cappadocia, their monks carving out entire complexes of cells, chapels, and refectories in the soft volcanic stone. While not all monastic sites were subterranean in the same sense as Derinquiu or Kaymakli, the ethos of withdrawal and concealment complemented the culture of underground living. The Cappadocian landscape thus became dotted with hidden sanctuaries above and below ground, blending survival with devotion. Even in periods of relative peace, the underground cities remained vital. They were not abandoned during lulls between invasions. Rather, they were maintained, repaired, and sometimes even expanded. This suggests a community mindset that embraced the underground as part of everyday life, not a desperate afterthought. Oral traditions likely reinforced this, with parents teaching children how to move silently through passages, how to roll the heavy doors, how to navigate by torchlight. For the people of Cappadocia, the underground was as real a world as the one lit by the sun. There is also evidence that the underground cities were used as nodes in larger networks. Tunnels sometimes extended for kilometers, connecting separate complexes or linking villages to central refuges. Some archaeologists suggest that in times of great crisis, entire regions could coordinate retreats into these subterranean webs, transforming valleys into ghostly landscapes, while life thrived unseen below. If true, this would make Cappadocia's underground not just a local adaptation, but one of the most remarkable examples of collective defense in human history. Byzantine control of Cappadocia waxed and waned with the tides of empire, but the underground endured. It became a testament to resilience, a silent chronicle of centuries in which ordinary farmers and families faced the uncertainties of geopolitics with remarkable ingenuity. They lacked the marble palaces of Constantinople or the fortified walls of Antioch, yet their survival strategy was no less effective. To descend into one of these cities today is to step back into that Byzantine age of vigilance. The air is cool, the walls close, the silence almost total. Torchlight reveals niches carved for lamps, troughs for animals, soot stains from ancient fires. One can imagine the hum of whispered prayers, the distant lowing of oxen, the muted laughter of children, life continuing in defiance of war and chaos. In Byzantium, emperors and generals commanded armies, debated doctrine, and erected monuments. But in Cappadocia, survival belonged to the anonymous. The stonecutters who carved passages, the families who fled into them, the monks who painted saints on walls where sunlight never reached. Their story is not written in chronicles, but in the rock itself. Every passage, every carved niche, is a word in a silent language of endurance. The golden age of Cappadocia's underground was thus not defined by wealth or conquest, but by survival, a survival that spoke to the heart of the Byzantine spirit. In a world of uncertainty, where frontiers could collapse overnight, where cities could burn, and where empires themselves could falter, the people of Cappadocia carried within them a quiet, subterranean confidence. They knew that beneath their feet lay a second world, always ready to shelter them from whatever storms history might bring. The Byzantine heartland was never free from fear, but in Cappadocia the fear was sharpened into habit, pressed into the rhythms of everyday life. From the 7th century onward, a new adversary appeared upon the horizon, the Arab armies of the Rashidun, Umayyad, and later Abbasid caliphates. With the rapid spread of Islam from the deserts of Arabia, the Byzantine frontier shifted overnight, and Cappadocia found itself at the crossroads of a centuries-long struggle. What had once been a peripheral province became a zone of contact and conflict, where cultures clashed and populations endured under the shadow of war. Arab-Byzantine conflict was not constant, but it was cyclical. Great raids swept into Anatolia, sometimes annually, other times in waves punctuated by fragile truces. For Cappadocia, lying in the direct path between Syria and the Anatolian plateau, these incursions meant devastation. Villages were plundered, monasteries torched, and populations captured for slavery. The chronicles of Theophanes the Confessor and later Byzantine writers describe Cappadocia as a corridor of suffering, where the movement of armies left scars upon both land and people. Yet within this crucible of violence, the underground cities proved their worth. When watchmen spied dust rising on the horizon or received word from scouts, entire communities could vanish within hours. The entrances to Derinquiu, Kamakli, and countless smaller sites were concealed, often hidden beneath homes, barns, or courtyards. To an invading army, the surface world appeared abandoned, livestock gone, hearths extinguished. But below the ground, life pulsed quietly in the labyrinths of stone. Archaeological evidence suggests that this period saw renewed expansion and fortification of the subterranean complexes. Passageways were narrowed intentionally to slow intruders. Trap holes were carved above corridors, allowing defenders to pour hot oil or burning debris on enemies who ventured too far. Circular stone doors, already massive, were set at key junctures to isolate sections of the city. In many places, storage rooms grew larger, wells were deepened, and ventilation shafts widened. These were not luxuries, but necessities, for raids could last weeks, and only careful planning ensured survival. The Arab-Byzantine wars also left marks of faith underground. As Cappadocia became a frontier of Christendom, its rock-hewn sanctuaries took on new meaning. Frescoes depicting St. George slaying the dragon or Christ enthroned as Pantocrator were not simply devotional art, but declarations of defiance, painted deep in the earth where worship could not be interrupted by raiding cavalry. The underground churches of Cappadocia speak silently of a people determined to preserve their spiritual life even when their surface existence was perpetually threatened. And yet, the story of this period is not only one of hostility. Between Byzantines and Arabs, there were also moments of cultural exchange. Prisoners ransomed, merchants traveling between frontiers shared agricultural techniques. Some scholars have even suggested that Cappadocia's underground networks may have been known to Arab commanders, though the difficulty of storming such hidden fortresses made them impractical targets. For the most part, the subterranean communities survived precisely because they were difficult to detect, impossible to conquer, and invaluable to the resilience of Byzantine frontier life. The Arab incursions peaked in the 8th and 9th centuries, when the Abbasids launched massive campaigns deep into Anatolia. The city of Tyana, not far from Cappadocia, was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. Yet still, the underground cities endured. Their very obscurity was their strength. Unlike the fortified walls of Constantinople or Antioch, which could be breached or battered, Cappadocia's fortresses were invisible, dispersed across valleys and cliffs, hidden beneath ordinary villages. They were not symbols of imperial grandeur, but of communal survival. By the 10th century, shifting fortunes altered the balance of power. Byzantine emperors such as Nicephorus II Phocas and John I Tzimiskes launched counteroffensives, pushing Arab forces back across the Taurus Mountains and reclaiming lost territories. For Cappadocia, this brought a measure of relief, though not permanent security. The underground cities remained in use, maintained as guardians against the ever-present possibility of renewed invasion. Indeed, their persistence suggests that even in times of victory, Cappadocians placed little faith in the stability of empires. The earth itself was the only fortress they could truly trust. Daily life underground during these centuries was marked by a strange duality. On the surface, fields were plowed, vineyards tended, and flocks grazed under the open sky. But at a moment's notice, families could abandon their homes, carrying food, water, and tools below. Children were taught from an early age to move silently, to navigate by torchlight, to respect the sacred and fragile air shafts that kept them alive. Underground, routines adapted, meals cooked communally, prayers whispered in stone chapels, animals tended in rock-cut stables. There must have been fear, but also a strange sense of unity, for survival depended on cooperation. It is worth remembering that the Cappadocians were not an isolated people, but part of a vast Byzantine world that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. Their emperors resided in Constantinople, their bishops answered to patriarchs, their soldiers marched under imperial banners. Yet at the most intimate level, survival came down to what their own hands had carved in the earth. The underground cities were, in many ways, an act of quiet rebellion against the grand narratives of empire. They said, "We will not vanish when empires clash. We will endure." Legends likely grew around these hidden realms. To invaders, Cappadocia may have seemed haunted, its valleys empty, its inhabitants elusive as phantoms. To children raised in villages above, the underground was both sanctuary and mystery, a second world that belonged to their people alone. Over centuries, the practice of retreating below became woven into identity, not merely a strategy, but a way of being. By the end of the Arab-Byzantine Wars, Cappadocia had proven itself one of the most resilient frontiers of the medieval world. Empires rose and fell, armies advanced and retreated, but the people of Cappadocia had outlasted them all by burrowing deeper into the stone. Their underground cities, expanded and perfected during this era, stood as monuments to the ordinary yet extraordinary will to live. In the quiet chambers of Derinquiu and Kamakli, one can still feel the weight of those centuries. The soot-blackened ceilings of kitchens, the carved troughs for animals, the narrow choke points where defenders once crouched. Each detail is a whisper of lives lived in vigilance. These were not kings or generals, but farmers, mothers, children, and monks who turned their very landscape into a weapon of endurance. The Arab crescent cast long shadows over Cappadocia, but those shadows never extinguished its light. Beneath the earth, the people of this land wrote their own history in silence, a history that endured long after the armies above had passed. The 11th century marked a turning point not only for Cappadocia, but for the entire Byzantine world. At Manzikert in 1071, the Byzantine Empire suffered one of its most devastating defeats at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The battle was not just a loss of land. It was a rupture in the very identity of Anatolia. In the decades that followed, waves of Turkish tribes swept across the plateau, settling valleys and mountainsides that had long been Byzantine strongholds. Cappadocia, once a frontier fortress of Christendom, was suddenly thrust into a new cultural and political order. For the people of Cappadocia, this was not an abstract shift in imperial allegiance. It was a transformation felt in the rhythms of daily life, the language of rulers, the administration of taxes, the practice of religion. Yet one truth remained unchanged. The underground cities continued to serve as guardians of survival. In times of unrest, raids, or shifting alliances, communities still retreated below. The earth remained constant even when banners above changed from the double-headed eagle of Byzantium to the crescent moon of the Seljuks. The Seljuks, unlike the marauding armies that had once swept across the land, sought not only to conquer, but also to govern. They established new towns, caravanserais, and mosques across Anatolia, weaving Cappadocia into the fabric of a wider Islamic world that stretched from Persia to the Levant. Kayseri, on Cappadocia's edge, grew into a major Seljuk hub, its markets bustling with merchants carrying silks, spices, and ceramics along the Silk Road. The underground cities, once hidden fortresses of Byzantine peasants, found themselves coexisting with new centers of commerce and culture above ground. Archaeological evidence suggests that the underground cities did not vanish in this era but adapted. Some chambers bear architectural features from the Seljuk period. Arches cut in styles distinct from Byzantine predecessors, inscriptions in Arabic script, and traces of modifications that suggest continued habitation. This blending of traditions speaks to the resilience of Cappadocians, who neither abandoned their heritage nor resisted change entirely, but absorbed elements of new rulers while safeguarding their survival strategies. Life under the Seljuks was not uniformly harsh. Many Christian communities remained, protected as people of the book under Islamic law, paying taxes in return for the right to practice their faith. Cappadocia became a landscape of coexistence, where rock-cut churches adorned with Byzantine frescoes stood not far from Seljuk caravanserais with their austere stone walls. For a time, a fragile balance was maintained, though always with the undertone of potential conflict. The underground world retained its role in this balance. While some sites likely fell into disuse as Seljuk orders stabilized the region, others remained crucial in times of political upheaval. The 12th and 13th centuries saw struggles between rival Seljuk sultans, Mongol invasions pressing into Anatolia, and the looming specter of crusaders crossing the land. In such turbulence, the underground sanctuaries once again proved invaluable. The people of Cappadocia knew that empires were unreliable guardians, but the earth never betrayed them. It is tempting to imagine that the underground cities existed only as refuges, but in truth they were more than that. Under Seljuk rule, some may have functioned as hidden storehouses for grain, wine, and goods during unstable times, ensuring that trade and agriculture could continue despite political shifts. Others may have served as safe havens for monks and clergy, preserving Christian traditions even as Islamic institutions rose above ground. In this way, the subterranean landscape became a quiet stage upon which the drama of cultural resilience played out. The Seljuk presence also brought indirect benefits. With the construction of caravanserais across Cappadocia, trade routes flourished, and prosperity trickled even to the remote valleys. Merchants traveling through the region may have carried stories of the underground cities, marveling at their ingenuity. Though no detailed Seljuk chronicles of Cappadocia's subterranean marvels survive, oral traditions may well have preserved whispers of these hidden worlds, blending them into the folklore of Anatolia. One striking feature of this period is the endurance of Christian art underground. Frescoes from the 11th to 13th centuries show vibrant depictions of saints and biblical scenes, painted despite the political transformations above. Some were later defaced, their faces scratched out during periods of iconoclasm or religious tension. Yet the very act of painting deep in the earth reflects defiance and faith. In the flickering light of oil lamps, Cappadocian Christians continued to assert their identity, even as Seljuk mosques rose to the heavens above. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century further tested the region. As Seljuk authority fractured under Mongol overlordship, Cappadocia became once again a land of shifting powers and precarious survival. In such times, the underground cities regained their urgency. The very same corridors that had once sheltered families from Arab raids centuries earlier now protected them from Mongol incursions and local bandits taking advantage of the chaos. Survival, once more, meant descent into the shadowed earth. By the late 13th century, Cappadocia had become a palimpsest of civilizations. The Seljuk architectural legacy blended with Byzantine churches, Armenian monasteries, and Persian influences, creating a cultural mosaic unlike any other. Beneath it all, the underground cities endured as timeless constants. They were not merely relics of the past, but living systems, reactivated whenever the earth above grew dangerous. The Seljuk period reminds us that the underground cities were not static monuments, but evolving entities. They were shaped as much by cultural exchange as by fear of invasion, as much by trade as by war. To the people of Cappadocia, they were not curiosities, but essential infrastructure, part of the rhythm of life across centuries of uncertainty. In their silent endurance, these subterranean labyrinths embodied the greatest truth of Cappadocia's history, that survival often depends not on resisting change, but on adapting to it, weaving new threads into old fabric, and finding safety not in power, but in persistence. The Seljuks may have shifted the face of Cappadocia, but they could not erase the cities beneath. In those shadowed chambers, generations continued to live, worship, and endure, carrying forward a tradition of resilience that no conquest could extinguish. The 13th century brought storms fiercer than Cappadocia had seen in centuries, storms not of wind and rain, but of steel and fire. The Mongols, having swept across the steppes and shattered kingdoms from China to the Middle East, now turned their gaze on Anatolia. In 1243, at the Battle of Kozdag, the Seljuk armies crumbled before Mongol might. What followed was not an orderly rule but decades of political fragmentation, taxation so crushing it bled villages dry, and raiders who used chaos as cover for plunder. For Cappadocia's people, the stability promised under the Seljuks dissolved into uncertainty. Once more, the underground cities became lifelines of survival. The Mongols were feared not only for their military ferocity, but for the aura of inevitability that seemed to surround them. Town after town across Anatolia fell into submission, their inhabitants forced to provide tribute in livestock, coin, and grain. The central government of the Seljuks shrank into a shadow, its sultans little more than figureheads under Mongol oversight. Local warlords, petty rulers, and bandit bands emerged in the vacuum. For the farmers and herders of Cappadocia, this was a time of exposure, when the open valleys no longer felt safe. The earth beneath their feet, however, still offered sanctuary. Accounts of this period are sparse, but oral tradition and archaeological evidence whisper of lives lived once more in secrecy. Chambers in Derinquiu and Kaymakli show signs of expansion and reuse during these centuries. Narrower passages were cut deeper into the rock, ventilation shafts extended further to support growing underground populations. The rolling stone doors that could be pulled shut to seal off passages were reactivated, not as relics, but as shields against the uncertainties above. It is not hard to imagine what drove families underground in these years. A rumor of Mongol riders moving along the trade routes. A sudden raid by tax collectors demanding more than a family could afford. Whispers of famine in a neighboring valley. Each threat was enough to trigger dissent. Livestock herded into stone stalls. Children carried into dim corridors, families clutching jars of grain and skins of water as they vanished into safety. The Mongols themselves may not have sought out every subterranean refuge, for their aim was tribute and dominance, not endless pursuit. Yet the underground cities gave Cappadocians leverage, a place to vanish until danger passed, a means of keeping life intact even under oppressive overlords. The Mongol period, while brutal, did not erase Cappadocia's communities precisely because these networks of stone allowed them to endure. At the same time, this age brought new cultural influences into the region. The Mongols, though devastating in war, were not destroyers of civilization by nature. They absorbed and facilitated trade across vast distances, linking Anatolia to Persia, China, and beyond. The Silk Road, running through Cappadocia, remained vital, carrying not only goods but ideas. Seljuk caravanserais, still functioning under Mongol oversight, became nodes of this exchange. Cappadocians may have watched as merchants from as far as Samarkand or Baghdad passed through their valleys, while below, their own survival strategies continued largely hidden. Religious life during this period reflected both endurance and adaptation. Christian communities, though under increasing pressure, continued to worship in rock-cut churches, some still adorned with vibrant frescoes. A handful of frescoes from the 13th century suggest continued artistic output despite political turmoil. Muslim populations grew under Mongol Seljuk influence, building mosques and schools above the valleys. Thus, Cappadocia once again became a place where multiple faiths intersected. Its underground sanctuaries offering neutrality when the surface grew dangerous. The Mongol presence, however, was not eternal. By the late 13th century, their control weakened, giving rise to small emirates across Anatolia. This fragmentation might seem chaotic, but for Cappadocians, it was a return to an old pattern. Local rulers came and went, alliances shifted, but the underground remained constant. A family could be born under Seljuk rule, grow old under Mongol dominance, and see their grandchildren raised under a new emir, all while their community descended into the same stone corridors whenever danger drew too near. Archaeologists often marvel at the longevity of these underground complexes. Unlike castles, which required constant repair, or cities, which could be razed, the subterranean networks endured across centuries of political upheaval. The volcanic tuff from which they were carved was both soft enough to cut and durable enough to last. This geological gift, combined with generations of human adaptation, ensured that each wave of conquest failed to erase Cappadocia's way of life. The 13th and early 14th centuries can be seen as an age when Cappadocia withdrew inward, a society that learned to preserve itself by retreating into shadow. If life above ground was unstable, life below was continuous. Food could be stored, animals sheltered, and faith practiced in secrecy. Children would have grown up learning the paths through tunnels as naturally as fields, recognizing the dim glow of oil lamps as familiar as daylight. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Generations of retreat shaped a culture accustomed to silence, secrecy, and resilience. Unlike the cities of the Mediterranean coast, where prosperity was tied to open trade and civic display, Cappadocia fostered a tradition of survival that depended on invisibility. To live while here meant knowing when to disappear. This legacy, forged under Mongol domination, deepened a cultural trait that had begun centuries earlier under Byzantium: the instinct to trust stone and shadow more than shifting powers above. By the mid-14th century, as Mongol influence waned, new powers emerged: the Beyliks, Turkish principalities that carved out territories across Anatolia. Once again, Cappadocia found itself on shifting ground, neither fully safe nor fully threatened, but always alert. The underground cities, honed and tested through centuries of use, stood ready. Their resilience was not a relic of the past, but a living strategy, passed down like an heirloom, ensuring that each new generation could endure whatever storms the world unleashed. The Mongol era in Cappadocia left scars of fear, but also strengthened the identity of a people for whom survival was more important than conquest. The underground cities were never monuments to triumph. They were monuments to persistence, carved in silence, yet echoing with centuries of footsteps. In the long arc of Cappadocia's history, the Mongols were but one more storm, and the earth, patient, protective, enduring, remained the one true constant. The 14th century gave way to the 15th, and Anatolia, fractured by Mongol retreat and torn between rival Beyliks, was once more gathering itself under a new force. From the small frontier principality of Osman Ghazi's descendants rose an empire that would stretch across 3 continents: the Ottomans. With their ascent, Cappadocia once again became folded into a larger political tapestry, though its role was more subdued than in earlier centuries. This was not a frontier of imperial ambition, but a landscape of passage, of pilgrimage, and of survival. Yet even under the long shadow of Ottoman stability, the underground cities retained their quiet purpose, waiting like lungs beneath the surface, breathing in danger and exhaling relief. The Ottomans, unlike the Mongols, did not sweep into Anatolia as an alien scourge. They emerged from its soil, Turkish in tongue, Islamic in faith, pragmatic in rule. By the late 14th century, their victories had consolidated swaths of central Anatolia, and by the 15th, Cappadocia lay firmly under their authority. On the surface, this new order meant taxation, conscription, and integration into imperial administration. Roads were maintained, caravan routes secured, and markets revived. For the first time in centuries, there was a sense of continuity above the valleys. Yet the memory of insecurity lingered deep in the hearts of Cappadocia's people, and memory is a stubborn guide. The underground remained a part of their defensive imagination. The Ottomans had little reason to suppress these subterranean worlds. They posed no threat to state authority, no rebellion brewed in the dark. Instead, they existed as community assets, activated in times of local unrest or when brigands roamed too close. Travelers of the 15th and 16th centuries sometimes recorded tales of underground houses or curious tunnels in Cappadocia, but they were often seen as curiosities rather than strategic fortresses. This obscurity, paradoxically, protected them. What was overlooked could not easily be destroyed. At the same time, Cappadocia above ground took on new characteristics. Ottoman architects introduced domed mosques and caravanserais that complemented the older Seljuk legacies. Villages expanded around stone mosques and markets, but the habit of building into the rock remained. Cave homes continued to serve as dwellings, their cool interiors suited to the harsh extremes of Anatolian climate. Thus, the surface world mirrored the subterranean, stone as shelter, permanence carved into impermanence. Religion during the Ottoman centuries layered itself across Cappadocia in complex ways. Muslim populations grew steadily, building communities that blended with older Christian enclaves. Christians, largely Orthodox, continued to worship in rock-cut chapels and maintain their traditions, now as subjects of the empire's millet system, which allowed religious minorities autonomy in exchange for loyalty and tax. For them, the underground cities remained more than pragmatic shelters. They were extensions of identity. A Christian family, fearing sudden raids or local unrest, could descend into chambers where frescoes of saints still adorned the walls, their faith intertwined with the stone itself. The empire, vast as it was, did not eliminate local conflict. Banditry along the trade routes persisted, especially in periods when central authority weakened or wars drew resources elsewhere. Cappadocia's valleys, though distant from the empire's capitals, still felt tremors of instability. During such times, the underground cities once again proved their value. Livestock could be hidden, grain secured, families preserved until order returned. Even if years passed in peace, the knowledge that refuge was always near must have been an anchor of psychological security. Ottoman tax registers occasionally noted villages in Cappadocia with fewer households than expected, a mystery that modern historians sometimes connect to subterranean hiding, or families temporarily absent, concealed in stone labyrinths during times of unrest. The records are ambiguous, but they hint at a rhythm of retreat that continued even under an ostensibly stable empire. Trade, too, continued to bind Cappadocia to the wider world. The Silk Road had diminished in global importance after maritime routes redirected commerce, but caravans still crossed Anatolia, bringing Persian textiles, Arab spices, and Central Asian horses into Ottoman markets. Cappadocia, lying along internal routes, hosted caravans in its inns and markets. For local farmers, this meant opportunities to sell grain, wine, or wool. Yet below their feet, the underground remained a parallel economy of storage, silos carved into stone, cool enough to preserve food across seasons, sealed against spoilage and theft. The 15th and 16th centuries were also centuries of empire-wide transformation. Ottoman conquests reached into the Balkans, Egypt, and Hungary, and the empire became one of the most formidable states of its time. Yet Cappadocia remained peripheral, not a center of grand politics, but a witness to continuity. Its people contributed soldiers to imperial campaigns, taxes to the treasury, and prayers to God. But their most enduring inheritance was their quiet refusal to abandon the security of Earth. What is striking about this era is not dramatic tales of siege or grand battles underground. There were few. Instead, it was a century of quiet adaptation, where the underground shifted from emergency fortress to cultural memory. Still, memory has power. When 17th-century travelers described Cappadocia's subterranean villages, they encountered not ruins, but functioning refuges, living spaces that could still be activated if danger struck. Generations had passed, rulers had changed, but the instinct to descend had not withered. It is tempting to imagine a summer evening in Ottoman Cappadocia, villagers gathering in a courtyard, the call to prayer echoing across the valley, smoke rising from clay ovens. Life appears serene, yet beneath them, stone corridors remain ready, oil lamps stocked, rolling stone doors waiting. Children might sneak into tunnels for play, chasing echoes through passages their ancestors had dug centuries before. In doing so, they inherited not only stone but a mindset, a cultural blueprint for survival. The underground cities during the Ottoman centuries illustrate the paradox of security. Even when peace appears steady, communities that have endured centuries of invasion rarely abandon their defenses. Fear lingers longer than empires, shaping how people build, live, and imagine the future. Cappadocia's people knew this deeply. They did not dismantle the underground when the Ottomans rose. They preserved it, quietly, faithfully, generation after generation. By the 18th century, as Ottoman power began to strain under internal corruption and external pressures, Cappadocia's underground legacy remained intact. Its cities in shadow were not relics of a distant past, but dormant guardians of a people who never forgot that beneath every horizon of empire lay the possibility of collapse. Thus, the Ottoman centuries for Cappadocia were not about conquest or spectacular events beneath the ground, but about endurance, about the quiet survival of memory. The underground was no longer only about the crises of the moment. It had become tradition itself, woven into the identity of a people who, even when living in peace, always kept one eye turned toward the stone corridors waiting in silence below. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was beginning to falter, its once unshakable grip on power loosening under the pressure of wars with Austria, Russia, and Persia, as well as internal stagnation. For Cappadocia, this was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow shift in rhythm. The underground cities still lingered beneath the valleys, but now, for the first time in centuries, eyes from beyond Anatolia began to take a greater interest in them. What had long been practical refuges for villagers became curiosities for foreign travelers, merchants, and, eventually, scholars who carried tales of these subterranean labyrinths back to Europe. The 18th and 19th centuries were an age of exploration, when Europeans sought to catalog the world in encyclopedias and sketchbooks, to measure it in maps and diaries, to conquer its mysteries with ink as much as with armies. Cappadocia, with its dreamlike chimneys of stone and the whispered rumor of entire cities underground, fitted neatly into this desire for marvels. Caravans of Western travelers began to pass through the Ottoman domains more frequently, spurred by both commerce and curiosity. For many, Anatolia was a corridor to grander destinations, the Holy Land, Mesopotamia, Persia. Yet a number of them paused in Cappadocia, intrigued by tales of rock-cut churches and underground towns. Some of these travelers wrote in astonishment at what they saw. A French visitor in the mid-18th century described villages hidden beneath the soil, with stables, kitchens, and chapels carved entirely out of stone. Others marveled at how entire populations could vanish into the earth at the approach of bandits. The precision of these accounts varied, and in some cases exaggeration colored the descriptions, but they served an important purpose. They reintroduced the underground cities into the imagination of the wider world. By the early 19th century, as the Ottoman Empire weakened further and European influence in the region deepened, more systematic observations began. Missionaries, often traveling through Anatolia en route to Christian communities in the east, sometimes stayed in Cappadocia long enough to record the persistence of underground chapels. Archaeologically minded travelers, fascinated by the Byzantine and early Christian heritage of the region, noted the proximity of hidden tunnels to frescoed churches. For them, Cappadocia was less a home of Ottoman subjects and more a landscape frozen in biblical and Byzantine echoes. The underground cities acquired a double life during this period, one as practical refuges still used sporadically by locals, and another as subjects of Western romantic imagination. For villagers, they remained places of necessity, descended into when raids broke out or when rumors of unrest spread. For outsiders, they became symbols of mystery, exotic relics of a vanished world. This duality is what allowed them to survive largely intact. The Ottomans, preoccupied with maintaining imperial cohesion, neither invested in them nor dismantled them, while Europeans lacked the means or will to interfere. Thus, the underground cities persisted quietly, continuing to breathe in the silence of centuries. By the mid-19th century, Cappadocia had become a point of interest on the growing network of Orientalist travel literature. The Romantic movement in Europe sought places that blurred the line between history and myth, landscapes where the past clung visibly to the present. Cappadocia's valleys, with their surreal chimneys, frescoed caves, and hidden worlds below, seemed to embody this yearning. Artists sketched the landscape, writers penned reflections, and scholars speculated on the origins of the subterranean complexes. Were they Hittite, Roman, Byzantine? The answers varied, often guided more by imagination than archaeology. It was also during this century that Ottoman reforms, particularly the Tanzimat, reshaped Anatolia's administrative structures. Roads improved, railways began to inch closer, and foreign consuls stationed in Anatolian towns sometimes collected local curiosities. Yet, even with these developments, Cappadocia remained relatively remote. This remoteness was part of its allure. The underground cities were not monuments fenced and catalogued, but living presences embedded in village life. To enter one was not to step into a museum, but into a breathing continuity of survival. For the villagers themselves, European curiosity could be both a source of pride and unease. On one hand, to lead a traveler into hidden passages might bring small gifts, coins, or recognition. On the other, the underground was not a spectacle but a heritage of necessity, not something to be trivialized. Many communities kept the full extent of their underground network secret, revealing only fragments to outsiders. In this discretion lay another layer of preservation. By the late 19th century, as archaeology became increasingly professionalized, Cappadocia's underground cities began to attract more formal attention. Scholars debated their function. Were they purely defensive, or had they also served as monastic retreats? Some speculated that they had housed persecuted Christians under Roman rule, others that they were Byzantine wartime refuges. The truth, as we now know, was more layered, a palimpsest of centuries, where each generation carved new chambers into the living rock, responding to the fears of their age. Yet in the 19th century, certainty was elusive and speculation ran free. There is an evocative irony in this period of rediscovery. For centuries, Cappadocians had descended underground in times of fear, vanishing from sight to preserve their lives. Now, Europeans were descending underground in times of leisure, marveling not at survival, but at spectacle. The same stone corridors that once echoed with prayers of fear now resonated with the exclamations of tourists, the scratch of pens across journals, the gaze of sketchbooks capturing arches and shafts. What had been a refuge was becoming a curiosity, and in that transformation lay the seeds of future preservation and, eventually, tourism. Still, the underground remained enigmatic. No systematic excavations were conducted in the 19th century, and no empire-wide effort was made to catalog them. They lingered as rumors, fragments, half-documented marvels. Yet these scattered accounts were enough to spark interest abroad. Cappadocia was becoming known not only for its surface beauty, but for its subterranean mysteries. In European salons and lecture halls, descriptions of cities beneath the earth, housing thousands, fired the imagination of audiences who had never seen Anatolia. Thus, the 18th and 19th centuries marked a shift. The underground cities were no longer merely hidden refuges or forgotten strongholds. They had entered the global imagination. For the people of Cappadocia, they remained practical and familiar, but for the rest of the world, they were increasingly exotic, even mythic. This dual identity, ordinary and extraordinary, would only deepen in the centuries to come as archaeology advanced and tourism grew. In these centuries of imperial decline and foreign curiosity, the underground cities endured, poised between obscurity and revelation. They were not yet fully understood, not yet mapped or excavated, but they had awakened in the minds of outsiders. The stone breath of Cappadocia was stirring once more, not in fear, but in fascination. The early 20th century was a time of upheaval across Anatolia, and Cappadocia was no exception. The Ottoman Empire, stretched thin and battered by wars, finally collapsed in the aftermath of World War I. The birth of the Turkish Republic in 1923 under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk heralded sweeping reforms, modernity rushing into every corner of the new nation. And yet, beneath the ground, Cappadocia's underground cities slumbered on. Their chambers, carved centuries earlier, did not change with shifting borders or ideologies. What did change was the world's ability and desire to study them more systematically. The fall of the Ottoman Empire marked a turning point in how outsiders and locals alike related to Cappadocia's subterranean heritage. Where once secrecy had been essential for survival, now the underground carried a new meaning. It became a repository of national history, a resource to be studied, understood, and, eventually, preserved. Archaeology, still in its adolescence as a science, began to look more seriously at the mysterious caverns below Cappadocia's villages. The age of speculation was slowly giving way to the age of excavation. In the first decades of the Republic, Ataturk's cultural reforms emphasized uncovering and celebrating the deep history of Anatolia. The aim was clear: to bind the young nation to an ancient heritage that reached beyond Ottoman and Islamic legacies, stretching into the pre-Islamic, even prehistoric, past. Cappadocia, with its surreal landscape and enigmatic cities beneath the earth, fitted perfectly into this mission. Scholars began traveling to the region, sometimes sponsored by European universities, sometimes supported by Turkish cultural institutions. Their reports became more detailed, noting not only the surface wonders of the fairy chimneys and cave churches, but also the existence of vast subterranean labyrinths. It was during the 1920s and 1930s that early systematic surveys began to emerge. Without the benefit of modern technology, these scholars relied on lanterns, compasses, and hand-drawn sketches, slowly tracing the twisting tunnels of Derinkuyu and Kemakli. Accounts from this period reveal a mixture of awe and confusion. Some passages were so narrow that explorers crawled on hands and knees. Others opened into vaulted chambers capable of holding entire congregations. Ventilation shafts stretched into darkness, suggesting depths far greater than anyone could map in a single visit. To early archaeologists, it was as if Cappadocia contained a honeycomb of civilizations, layered and expanded across millennia. The villagers, as always, remained gatekeepers. Many still used sections of the underground for storage or shelter, and they were not always eager to grant outsiders unfettered access. This wariness was understandable. To open one's cellar to foreign scholars was to risk losing privacy, perhaps even ownership. Yet curiosity often won out. Local guides led archaeologists through passages known only to families, revealing the hidden heart of villages that had for centuries lived in quiet partnership with the earth. Meanwhile, the political turbulence of the early 20th century meant that Cappadocia did not yet become a major tourist site. The young Turkish Republic was preoccupied with building railways, schools, and institutions of statehood. The region remained remote, accessible mostly by dirt roads, its inhabitants living in much the same way as their ancestors, tending vineyards, herding animals, carving new homes into the cliffs when needed. This very continuity allowed the underground cities to survive untouched by mass intrusion, preserving their fragile frescoes and chambers until the world was ready to study them with care. By the 1950s, a new wave of interest was cresting. Post-war archaeology was becoming more rigorous, blending excavation with anthropology and geology. Cappadocia attracted increasing attention, particularly from scholars interested in early Christianity. The rock-hewn churches of Gorim Valley, adorned with fading frescoes, were seen as crucial to understanding Byzantine monasticism. And always, beneath those churches, the underground whispered of even deeper mysteries. It was during this era that the first large-scale mapping of Derinkuyu began. Explorers found that the city stretched multiple levels beneath the earth, interconnected by tunnels that could be sealed with circular stone doors. Estimates suggested it could house as many as 20,000 people, numbers so vast that they defied belief. Kemakli revealed itself to be equally expansive, though more horizontally spread. Other towns, less famous but equally intricate, hinted that Cappadocia's underground was not a singular marvel, but part of a network of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of subterranean complexes. The archaeological community was fascinated, but also puzzled. Questions abounded. Who had begun these constructions? Hittites, Phrygians, Persians, Byzantines? What had been their primary function? Refuge, permanent habitation, monastic retreat? Without inscriptions or datable artifacts, the answers remained elusive. And yet this uncertainty only deepened the allure. Cappadocia became a canvas upon which theories were painted, each interpretation revealing as much about the scholar's imaginations as about the stone itself. The Turkish government began to recognize the cultural and historical value of Cappadocia during this time. Efforts were made to document, protect, and eventually open parts of the underground cities to visitors. In 1963, Derinkuyu was formally opened to the public, astonishing the world with its scale. By then, the global tourism industry was expanding rapidly, and Cappadocia's underground became part of its mystique, drawing travelers who wished to descend into the earth and touch the stones shaped by forgotten hands. But in the early decades of the 20th century, before the arrival of tour buses and guidebooks, there was still a sense of raw discovery. Scholars entering those tunnels by candlelight felt themselves pioneers, standing between history and myth. The underground cities were no longer just the inheritance of Cappadocian villagers. They were becoming part of the world's heritage, a shared wonder of human ingenuity. The dawn of archaeology in Cappadocia thus marked a new phase in the life of the underground. No longer only refuges, no longer only curiosities, they became objects of study, symbols of continuity between Turkey's deep past and its modern identity. Beneath the political upheavals of empire and republic, beneath wars and reforms, the stone labyrinths endured, waiting patiently for the light of scholarship to illuminate their shadows. By the mid-20th century, Cappadocia was no longer merely a quiet Anatolian region known for its vineyards, villages, and strange fairy chimneys. The outside world was beginning to take notice of its underground wonders, and the shift from obscurity to recognition unfolded rapidly. Where once the subterranean labyrinths were whispered about only by locals or studied in dim secrecy by intrepid scholars, they now began to emerge into the global imagination, transformed into symbols of human resilience and ingenuity. The 1960s were pivotal. In 1963, the Turkish government formally opened Derinkuyu, the deepest of the known underground cities, to the public. What had been a hidden warren beneath a modest Anatolian town suddenly became a centerpiece of national pride and an international sensation. Travelers descended into its shadowed corridors with flashlights and cameras, marveling at the sheer scale. Vast communal halls, endless staircases, wells carved deep into volcanic rock. Scholars estimated that the city could have sheltered upwards of 20,000 people in times of invasion. The revelation stunned not only tourists but also academics, who now realized that Cappadocia's underground was far more extensive than previously thought. Kaymakli soon followed, opening in 1964. Unlike Derinkuyu, which plunged vertically into the earth, Kaymakli spread horizontally with wide chambers and stables. Together, the two cities became the twin gateways into Cappadocia's underground heritage. Tourists were astonished, but so too were archaeologists. For the first time, systematic excavation and preservation efforts could be paired with public access, allowing global awareness to grow hand in hand with scholarship. The transformation of Cappadocia's underground cities into heritage sites mirrored Turkey's broader engagement with the international community. During the 1970s and 1980s, cultural tourism became a pillar of national development. Cappadocia, with its moon-like valleys, cave churches, and subterranean networks, fits seamlessly into this narrative. For local villagers, what had once been storerooms and secret passages were now attractions drawing visitors from across Europe, America, and beyond. Families who had long used underground spaces for storing food or animals found themselves guiding archaeologists, journalists, and curious adventurers. This opening brought both opportunity and challenge. On the one hand, tourism generated income in a region long isolated from the industrial heartlands of Türkiye. Ghost houses sprang up, and later, in the 1980s, the first cave hotels transformed ancient dwellings into modern accommodations. The underground became an economic resource, a way for Cappadocian communities to thrive in the modern world. On the other hand, increased foot traffic threatened the delicate balance of preservation. Frescoes, ventilation shafts, and stone staircases began to show signs of wear. Archaeologists warned of the dangers of uncontrolled access, and conservation efforts became increasingly urgent. Meanwhile, international scholars flocked to Cappadocia. Teams of archaeologists, architects, and historians sought to map the cities in detail. Their findings astonished the academic world. Derinkuyu alone stretched to at least 8 levels, with complex systems for air circulation, water storage, and communication between layers. The engineering precision was extraordinary, suggesting not a hurried construction in times of panic, but a deliberate, multi-generational effort to shape a secure subterranean world. Kaymakli revealed wine presses, granaries, and communal kitchens, evidence of daily life underground that went far beyond temporary refuge. Speculation about origins intensified. Were the earliest tunnels carved by the Hittites, as some suggested, or by the Phrygians in the first millennium BCE? Byzantine expansion during the early Christian centuries was more firmly attested, but it was clear that the foundations of these cities reached much deeper into antiquity. Without inscriptions or direct datable artifacts, certainty remained elusive. As always with Cappadocia, mystery lingered alongside fact. Scholars debated, but the broader public was captivated less by definitive answers than by the sheer wonder of walking where tens of thousands had once hidden. In 1985, Cappadocia's significance was officially recognized when Gorim National Park and the rock sites of Cappadocia were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This was a turning point. No longer just a regional curiosity, Cappadocia became a global treasure. UNESCO status brought not only prestige but also commitments to preservation, ensuring that the underground cities would be protected as part of humanity's shared cultural legacy. Derinkuyu and Kaymakli became the most famous, but dozens of smaller underground complexes, Oskanak, Matsi, Tatlarin, were cataloged and studied, though many remained closed to the public. By the late 20th century, Cappadocia was firmly embedded in the global tourism industry. Balloon flights over the valleys became iconic, while excursions into the underground cities offered visitors a glimpse into humanity's most extreme architectural adaptation. Scholars continued to map and analyze, but increasingly, the story of Cappadocia was told not only in academic journals, but also in glossy travel magazines, documentaries, and guidebooks. The subterranean became spectacle, but beneath that spectacle lay centuries of ingenuity, faith, and survival. The transformation of Cappadocia's underground cities in this era was profound. From secret refuges known only to villagers, they became stages on which global narratives of history, identity, and tourism played out. They symbolized Türkiye's ability to balance modernity with ancient heritage, science with myth, survival with spectacle. Yet for those who walked their narrow tunnels by candlelight, or who felt the cool breath of air rising through shafts carved a millennium ago, the experience remained deeply personal. The underground spoke of fear and hope, of ingenuity and continuity. As the 20th century drew to a close, Cappadocia's subterranean world had made the leap from hidden to world-renowned. The labyrinths that once shielded villagers from raiders now welcomed travelers from every continent. Archaeologists, preservationists, and locals stood at a crossroads. How to protect the fragile past while embracing the opportunities of a global future. The underground had been revealed, but in its shadows still lay stories waiting to be told. The latter half of the 20th century brought Cappadocia's underground cities into the light of international recognition, but with recognition came risk. What had survived for centuries hidden beneath volcanic soil now faced the scrutiny of tourism, the pressure of human footsteps, and the complications of modern development. These fragile subterranean labyrinths, carved by hand, reinforced by ingenuity, and weathered by centuries of use, stood at a crossroads between heritage and exploitation. The challenge was monumental: how to preserve what had been built for survival and secrecy, now exposed to the curious gaze of the world. The rise of mass tourism in Cappadocia after UNESCO's designation in 1985 fundamentally reshaped the region. Each year brought a growing influx of visitors eager to descend into Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, to brush their fingers against walls once touched by Byzantine monks and fleeing villagers. Local guides led groups through chambers where livestock once slept and families had whispered their prayers. For many, it was a thrilling journey into a hidden world. Yet every boot that scraped the floor, every hand that grazed the wall, every breath that filled the narrow passages contributed to the slow erosion of the delicate stone. Tough, for all its malleability, is also vulnerable. What human ingenuity had carved could, ironically, be undone by human presence. Preservation efforts were both necessary and fraught. Turkish archaeologists and conservationists, often supported by UNESCO and foreign institutions, began implementing protective measures. Certain chambers were reinforced, fragile frescoes sealed off, and some sections closed to the public entirely. Lighting systems were installed to guide visitors safely, though they brought unintended consequences. Heat and moisture from bulbs altered the microclimates of the underground spaces, accelerating the growth of mold and fungi. Ventilation shafts designed to carry fresh air centuries ago now struggled under the pressures of modern tourism. Beyond natural decay, the underground faced the specter of myth and sensationalism. As the sites gained popularity, stories grew bolder, often blurring the line between history and fantasy. Some writers claimed the tunnels stretched across all of Cappadocia, interlinking cities over dozens of miles, a hypothesis alluring but only partially substantiated. Others spun tales of lost civilizations, secret treasures, or even extraterrestrial influence. These claims, amplified by popular documentaries and fringe publications, captivated the public imagination but often obscured the more profound truth. That the cities were a testament to human resilience, carved not by mysterious forces but by communities facing real threats of invasion, persecution, and survival. The late 20th century also saw the birth of new excavations. As scholars dug deeper, both literally and metaphorically, they uncovered fresh mysteries. In the 1990s, at Ozkenak, a smaller underground complex near Avanos, researchers found unique defensive features: narrow tunnels equipped with holes for pouring hot oil onto intruders. Each discovery added to the mosaic of understanding, painting a portrait of a region whose people had anticipated danger with remarkable foresight. Yet the deeper archaeologists dug, the more questions emerged. Without inscriptions or definitive dating, much remained conjecture. Were the earliest phases Hittite, Phrygian, or something older still? The stone whispered, but not always clearly. Preservation extended beyond stone to the communities above. For centuries, villagers had used underground spaces pragmatically, for storage of food, for stables, or even as cellars. With the advent of tourism, some of these practices waned, replaced by roles as guides or hosts. This shift was both economic and cultural, as traditional ways of living adapted to the demands of a global audience. Balancing local livelihoods with heritage protection became a central issue. For many Cappadocians, the underground was not simply a tourist attraction but part of their ancestral identity. As the 21st century dawned, challenges grew sharper. Tourism increased exponentially, with Cappadocia becoming one of Türkiye's most iconic destinations, second only to Istanbul and Ephesus. Hot air balloons drifting across the valleys at sunrise became postcard images, drawing millions to the region each year. Yet this influx amplified the strain on fragile underground networks. Authorities wrestled with difficult decisions. Should more cities be opened to disperse the crowds, or should access remain tightly controlled? Some sites, like Derinkuyu, saw thousands of daily visitors during peak seasons, creating a tension between accessibility and conservation. Meanwhile, myths continued to evolve. Cappadocia's underground cities became darlings of the speculative imagination. Popular television series about ancient aliens proposed that the labyrinths were too complex to be the work of early civilizations. New Age writers described them as centers of lost wisdom, aligning them with myths of Atlantis or subterranean utopias. While historians and archaeologists pushed back, the effect was double-edged. On one hand, such stories risked trivializing authentic history. On the other, they ensured the cities remained alive in the global imagination, sustaining fascination and drawing in those who might otherwise overlook them. The real story, however, was more compelling than fiction. In the face of war, persecution, and empire, ordinary people had carved sanctuaries beneath their feet, creating worlds that could sustain entire populations for months. The ingenuity required to design ventilation shafts, wells, granaries, and defenses in stone was itself extraordinary. Preserving this truth became the mission of scholars and guardians alike. The Turkish government, in collaboration with UNESCO and local communities, has since increased efforts to safeguard the subterranean heritage. Digital mapping projects using 3D laser scanning have created detailed records of underground layouts, offering both research opportunities and preservation tools. These maps capture every twist and chamber, ensuring that even if erosion or collapse occurs, the architectural memory remains intact. Education campaigns have also been launched to encourage visitors to treat the underground with respect, reminding them that they are not merely entering tourist attractions, but walking in the footsteps of ancestors. The underground cities of Cappadocia today exist in a delicate balance. They are simultaneously global wonders, local heritages, and fragile archaeological treasures. Their survival into the future depends not only on stone and engineering, but on human choices, on whether we treat them as spectacles to consume or legacies to protect. The story of preservation is Ultimately, another chapter in their saga of survival, reminding us that history is never static. Like the air moving through the ancient shafts, it flows only as long as we allow it to breathe. The underground cities of Cappadocia are not only places of stone and history, they are also spaces of imagination. To descend into their labyrinths is to confront something deeply archetypal, a confrontation with the underworld, with darkness, with the hidden layers of existence. For centuries, these caverns have inspired myths, metaphors, and artistic visions. They are more than architectural feats. They are symbols of humanity's eternal dialogue with survival, secrecy, and the spiritual significance of what lies beneath. From the earliest accounts, travelers described Cappadocia's underground spaces with awe tinged with fear. To step below was to enter a liminal zone, one foot in history, another in myth. The ancients themselves often associated caves and subterranean spaces with divine encounters or passages to other realms. In Anatolia, myths of chthonic deities, those connected to earth, fertility, and death, echoed through the ages. It is possible, though unverified, that such beliefs colored the perception of these underground dwellings. Even in Byzantine times, chronicles sometimes portrayed the underground as a space of protection under God's providence, sanctified by the prayers of monks who carved chapels into volcanic walls. In literature, the underground cities have long functioned as metaphors for hidden truths and concealed histories. 19th-century European Romantic writers, swept up in Orientalist curiosity, often framed Cappadocia's subterranean realms as sites of mystery and exoticism. Their sketches and travelogues did more than describe stone walls. They layered the underground with symbolism, portraying it as a space where civilization literally buried itself against the violence of history. These early accounts may have exaggerated, but they shaped the imagination of a continent fascinated with the East as both ancient and enigmatic. In Turkish oral traditions, stories of underground refuges persisted in local memory. Folktales spoke of secret tunnels stretching endlessly beneath villages, of doors that closed at night to keep out jinn or hostile raiders, of wells that connected unseen worlds. Even as practical use declined, the imagination kept these cities alive. They became part of an inherited identity, markers of Cappadocia's uniqueness. Locals might not have known the precise age of Derinkuyu or Kemakli, but they understood them as places bound with both pride and caution. The symbolism of Cappadocia's underground has also resonated in modern spiritual and philosophical thought. To descend is to enact a kind of initiation, mirroring journeys found in myth. The Orphic descent into Hades, the Christian catacombs as sanctuaries of faith, the Sufi metaphors of inward retreat to discover divine truth. In this sense, the underground cities are more than archaeological curiosities. They mirror humanity's inner struggles, embodying the paradox of hiding to survive while seeking transcendence in the depths. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, global culture has continued to weave these subterranean realms into symbolic narratives. Writers of speculative fiction and fantasy have found inspiration in Cappadocia's labyrinths, imagining subterranean kingdoms, hidden civilizations, or dystopian refuges after apocalyptic collapse. The motif of humanity seeking salvation beneath the earth, whether in Cappadocia, in Tolkien's dwarven halls, or in futuristic bunkers, is a recurring archetype. It speaks to a primal awareness that beneath the surface lies not only protection but also the unknown. Tourism itself has contributed to this mythic layering. For many who visit, descending into Derinkuyu is less about strict history than about personal experience. The dark passages evoke feelings of awe, vulnerability, and curiosity. The psychological impact is undeniable. People emerge with stories not only of architecture but of emotion, of what it means to imagine thousands of lives once lived in shadow. These experiences enter modern identity, reinforcing Cappadocia as a cultural landscape where myth and history converge. The underground cities have also become powerful symbols in Turkey's national narrative. They reflect resilience in the face of invasion, creativity in adversity, and a continuity of Anatolian civilization stretching back millennia. For the Turkish Republic, Preserving and promoting these sites affirms cultural heritage on a global stage. They remind citizens and visitors alike that this land has always been a crossroads of civilizations, where survival demanded both ingenuity and faith. Yet with symbolism comes responsibility. The danger lies in allowing myth to overshadow truth. Sensationalist claims, whether of tunnels spanning all of Anatolia or connections to extraterrestrial builders, risk trivializing the profound human story. The real symbolism of the underground is not in fantasies of lost civilizations, but in the testimony of ordinary people carving life from stone. They remind us that history is not only made by kings and empires, but also by villagers, monks, and refugees who dug with bare hands to survive. At the same time, we should not dismiss the mythic power these cities hold. Their symbolic resonance is part of why they matter. History without imagination risks becoming sterile. Imagination without history risks becoming unmoored. Cappadocia's underground offers a rare synthesis, where tangible stone and intangible myth reinforce one another. To walk their passages is to engage in both archaeology and philosophy, to see the convergence of practical survival and eternal symbolism. Today, artists, poets, and spiritual seekers still find inspiration in these subterranean worlds. Contemporary Turkish writers use them as metaphors for cultural memory, for the hidden layers of identity suppressed by modernity, yet still alive beneath the surface. Painters capture the play of shadow and light in narrow corridors, evoking both claustrophobia and sanctuary. Musicians compose works inspired by the resonance of sound within stone chambers, imagining chants and prayers once carried through the air shafts. In this way, the underground continues to breathe not only history, but art. Ultimately, the symbolism of Cappadocia's underground cities lies in their paradoxes. They are dark, yet they speak of life. They are buried, yet they reveal history. They were made in fear, yet they testify to hope. Their enduring presence in literature, myth, and modern identity reflects the human need to give meaning to survival. To descend into them is not only to see the past. It is to glimpse the human capacity to turn adversity into creativity, to transform stone into sanctuary, and to find, even underground, a story worth telling. The underground cities of Cappadocia are not frozen relics of the past. They continue to challenge and inspire science, archaeology, and even technology today. Each new excavation peels back another layer of knowledge, revealing the ingenuity of ancient engineers and offering lessons that modern societies, with all their machines and algorithms, are only beginning to appreciate. The story of these subterranean wonders is therefore not merely a tale of history, but also a living dialogue between past and present, one where science and imagination meet in stone corridors carved centuries ago. Archaeological exploration of Cappadocia accelerated during the mid-20th century, when Turkish scholars and international teams began to investigate systematically. Until then, much of the knowledge about underground cities was based on rumor, local lore, and sensational travel accounts. Derinkuiu's rediscovery in 1963, when a local man stumbled upon a hidden passage behind a wall in his house, catalyzed a wave of research. Excavations soon revealed vast networks, multi-story complexes with stables, kitchens, churches, wine presses, and defensive mechanisms. What began as curiosity quickly grew into one of the most significant archaeological revelations of the modern era. The scientific questions were immense. How had people, with only hand tools, excavated such vast spaces without the tunnels collapsing? How did they ventilate fresh air into chambers that reached 8 or more stories underground? How did they prevent fire, manage sanitation, and provide water for thousands of inhabitants? The answers revealed a level of engineering sophistication rarely credited to pre-modern societies. Ventilation shafts, some reaching over 50 meters, were carved with precision, ensuring airflow throughout even the deepest chambers. Channels carried fresh water from underground aquifers, while carefully sloped floors directed wastewater away from living areas. Stone doors, circular and weighing several hundred kilograms, could be rolled into place to secure tunnels, evidence of both defensive awareness and clever design. Geologists also became fascinated. The unique volcanic tuff of Cappadocia, soft when first cut, hardening on exposure to air, proved to be the secret ingredient enabling such vast excavation. The material was forgiving enough to carve, yet stable enough to endure centuries. In this sense, Cappadocia itself was both a canvas and a collaborator, its geology inviting human adaptation. This union of natural environment and human creativity lies at the heart of why these underground cities endure. Anthropologists added further layers of understanding by asking not only how, but why these subterranean worlds were made. Archaeological finds, pottery, grinding stones, religious symbols, suggested communal living under extraordinary circumstances. Radiocarbon dating and stylistic analysis tied the earliest phases of construction to the Phrygians and possibly the Hittites, with later expansions during Byzantine times. Historical context painted a vivid backdrop. Waves of invasion, from Persians to Arabs to Mongols, made refuge a necessity. For Byzantine Christians in particular, the underground provided sanctuary for both body and faith. Thus, the scientific study of these spaces does not only illuminate engineering, it reveals survival strategies shaped by centuries of conflict. Modern science has also looked at the underground cities through the lens of resilience. Urban planners and architects marvel at how these ancient systems anticipate issues still central to sustainable design. Natural ventilation, temperature regulation, and community-oriented spaces are ideas that resonate strongly in a world struggling with climate change and urban overcrowding. Some architects now study Cappadocia's underground to inspire eco-friendly designs, structures that minimize energy consumption by borrowing principles of insulation and airflow from these subterranean models. Technology has deepened our understanding even further. Ground-penetrating radar, 3D laser scanning, and drones have mapped vast stretches of underground Cappadocia without invasive digging. These tools have revealed tunnels stretching kilometers between cities like Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, suggesting interlinked networks larger than once imagined. Some estimates propose that over 200 underground settlements exist, many still unexplored, hidden beneath modern villages and fields. The potential for discovery remains enormous. These findings also raise philosophical questions. In an era of digital speed and skyscrapers, the underground cities remind us that technological brilliance is not solely a product of modernity. Ancient societies, without electricity or steel, designed systems that were not only functional but enduring. Their legacy challenges the arrogance of progress, reminding us that innovation has many faces, and that sometimes survival requires looking downward, not upward. The scientific and technological resonance of Cappadocia also extends to unexpected fields. Disaster management experts have studied the underground as models for human shelter in extreme conditions, whether during war, natural disaster, or even potential future colonization of Mars. The controlled climate, reliance on natural ventilation, and capacity to house entire populations make them compelling analogs for life in hostile environments. NASA itself has taken interest in underground living, investigating how lessons from places like Cappadocia might inform extraterrestrial habitats. To imagine the Byzantine monks of Derinkuyu unwittingly paving the way for space colonization may seem fantastical, yet the parallels are there. At the same time, archaeology continues to confront limits. Many tunnels remain unexcavated, partially due to their proximity to modern towns, partially due to the sheer scale of the task. There are also cultural and ethical considerations. To excavate is to risk collapse. To expose is to alter what was preserved by secrecy. Turkish authorities, balancing preservation with tourism, have restricted certain sites while opening others, seeking to protect both heritage and community livelihoods. Science has not stripped Cappadocia of its mystery, it has deepened it. The more that researchers uncover, the more questions arise. Were these cities truly capable of housing tens of thousands, or is that an exaggeration born from modern awe? Did entire populations retreat underground for months, or were the cities used more episodically, as temporary refuges in times of raid? Archaeology suggests the latter, but uncertainty remains. As with many ancient marvels, definitive answers elude us, leaving room for imagination, for humility in the face of history's silence. Ultimately, The scientific legacy of Cappadocia's underground cities lies in their capacity to remind us that knowledge is layered, like the Earth itself. Geology, archaeology, anthropology, architecture, and engineering converge in their study. Each discipline adds perspective, yet none captures the whole. The underground cities resist being reduced to mere data. They insist on remaining lived spaces, places of fear and hope, carved by hands whose names we will never know. In this sense, the modern scientific encounter with Cappadocia mirrors the ancient one. Just as the first villagers descended with tools into the volcanic rock, uncertain but determined, so too do today's researchers enter these tunnels, armed with radar and scanners, but still confronted by mystery. Both past and present share the same truth, that to go underground is to accept limits, to recognize that survival and knowledge alike demand patience, courage, and respect for what lies hidden. Thus, the underground cities of Cappadocia are not only objects of study, they are teachers. They instruct us in resilience, in humility, in the art of using what is at hand to create sanctuary. They remind us that survival is not merely a matter of strength, but of adaptation. And they suggest that even in an age of satellites and skyscrapers, we might still have something to learn from the shadows beneath our feet. As the 21st century advances, the underground cities of Cappadocia no longer function as fortresses against invaders or sanctuaries for persecuted communities. Instead, they stand as reminders, preserved in stone, of humanity's capacity to adapt to overwhelming adversity. Yet while their original purpose has faded, their echoes continue to shape modern consciousness. The subterranean past is not silent. It reverberates in tourism, culture, scholarship, and even in humanity's search for identity amid the turbulence of modern life. In the present day, millions of travelers visit Cappadocia every year. They arrive first for the iconic images, hot air balloons drifting over fairy chimneys, the sculpted valleys that glow rose and ochre under sunrise. Yet many soon find themselves drawn beneath the earth, descending narrow staircases into a hidden world. Tourism has transformed the underground cities into stages of encounter, where the past is performed for the present. Guides lead visitors through stables and chapels, kitchens and communal rooms, narrating stories of Byzantine monks, Ottoman villagers, and mysterious engineers of earlier epochs. The silence that once cloaked these spaces now resounds with the footsteps of the curious. For some, the underground cities provoke wonder at human ingenuity. For others, they stir unease. Claustrophobic tunnels, dim light, and the weight of stone above evoke visceral reminders of mortality and confinement. The experience is not unlike time travel, forcing modern individuals, accustomed to light, air, and digital space, to confront what survival once demanded. In this way, the underground cities are mirrors, reflecting the contrast between ancient necessity and modern privilege. Tourism has brought both preservation and pressure. Revenue from visitors funds archaeological work and conservation, ensuring that tunnels are stabilized, entrances reinforced, and fragile wall carvings protected. Yet tourism also risks commodifying the underground cities, reducing them to spectacle rather than sacred inheritance. The challenge lies in balance, to make these spaces accessible without stripping them of mystery. Turkish authorities, alongside international heritage organizations, continue to navigate this delicate tension. Beyond tourism, Cappadocia's subterranean legacy influences culture and imagination in profound ways. Writers, filmmakers, and artists repeatedly draw inspiration from its labyrinthine depths. Novels describe rebels hiding underground. Films borrow the motif of hidden worlds beneath the surface. The underground cities remind humanity that history is layered, that civilizations build not only upward but downward, into darkness. In literature, they symbolize resilience, secrecy, and the complexity of human existence. In art, they stand as metaphors for the unconscious, the hidden chambers of memory and fear. Academia, too, continues to wrestle with Cappadocia's subterranean heritage. Archaeologists refine chronologies, mapping connections between tunnels and dating artifacts. Historians debate their usage. Were they true long-term settlements or temporary refuges activated only in crisis? Anthropologists study the communal structures implied by shared kitchens, wine presses, and chapels, asking how cooperation was enforced in times of duress. Each discipline offers pieces of the puzzle, but as with so many ancient mysteries, the complete picture remains elusive. This uncertainty is itself a gift. The underground cities resist total explanation, compelling scholars to approach with humility, acknowledging the limits of evidence. The resonance of Cappadocia extends further, touching global concerns. In an age of climate instability and political upheaval, the underground cities model resilience. Their natural insulation provided warmth in winter and coolness in summer without fossil fuels. Their ventilation shafts ensured breathable air. Their communal layouts fostered cooperation over isolation. Architects and urban planners looked to such principles as they designed sustainable housing, refugee shelters, and even speculative colonies on Mars. Ancient Cappadocia thus participates in futuristic conversations, its lessons stretching from Anatolia to the stars. Yet the deepest echo of the underground cities lies in what they reveal about the human condition. To carve life into stone, to retreat underground in fear, yet also in hope, is to embody a paradox. These communities were both vulnerable and resilient, hiding from overwhelming threats, yet refusing to vanish. The underground cities remind us that survival is not about invincibility, but adaptation. They teach that darkness can become sanctuary, that endurance often requires sacrifice, and that human beings, when pressed, find ways to turn even rock into refuge. Standing in Dustbound today, one might pause in the vast chamber believed to have served as a school or communal hall. The air is cool, the silence heavy, broken only by the faint echo of footsteps. Above ground, the world races forward. Cars speed, satellites orbit, the digital sphere hums ceaselessly. But below, one feels the weight of continuity, the persistence of life through centuries of chaos. It is humbling to imagine that children once recited prayers here, that families once huddled in fear as armies marched overhead, that hands without names shaped the walls still standing. The underground cities also remind modern humanity of its interconnectedness. They were never the work of solitary individuals, but of entire communities united by necessity. To carve chambers, to dig ventilation shafts, to maintain livestock below ground. These required collective effort, trust, and discipline. In an era increasingly marked by individualism, such lessons are poignant. Survival, the underground cities teach, is rarely achieved alone. It is forged in cooperation, in the willingness to share both labor and fear. Thus, the echoes of Cappadocia speak not only to archaeologists or tourists, but to all who seek meaning in a fractured world. They remind us that beneath every civilization lies a hidden layer of struggle and resilience. They challenge us to ask, what will remain of our own cities in centuries to come? What stories will our architecture tell of us? Will our monuments speak of arrogance, of unsustainable excess, or of adaptation and care? The subterranean past of Cappadocia is therefore not a curiosity, but a call. It urges us to look inward and downward, to acknowledge both fragility and strength, and to recognize that endurance often comes from unexpected places. Just as the people of Anatolia found safety in shadowed corridors, perhaps we, too, must learn to find resilience in humility, community, and the wisdom of those who came before. And so, the underground cities endure, not as ruins, but as voices. They whisper through stone walls and narrow tunnels, reminding us that history is not only above ground in marble palaces and imperial fortresses. Sometimes, the most enduring legacies are hidden, carved in silence, waiting patiently for the world to listen. To wander the underground cities of Cappadocia is to step into a paradox. Here, beneath the ground, humanity sought safety by retreating into darkness. Yet it was in that very darkness that they preserved the flame of continuity. Dustbound, Kamakli, and the other subterranean labyrinths are not monuments of conquest, not testaments to imperial ambition, but rather sanctuaries of survival, born of necessity and endurance. Their walls, carved by nameless hands, still hold the imprint of a collective will to live. Across centuries, these subterranean strongholds sheltered families, guarded faith, and gave breathing space to cultures under siege. Their silence tells of the fragility of existence, how quickly the familiar world above could be shattered by armies, persecution, or disaster. Yet their very existence also affirms the opposite truth, that when threatened, humanity adapts with astonishing creativity. To carve an entire city underground was no small feat. It required trust, communal effort, and knowledge passed across generations. In that way, the underground cities are less about stone and more about people, about the courage to endure when circumstances demanded retreat. Today, as visitors descend through the narrow tunnels, guided by electric lights and cameras, it can be easy to forget the fear and hope that once filled these spaces. But if one pauses in silence, away from the groups of tourists, there is still a hum in the air, a memory of voices long vanished, of prayers whispered in secret chapels, of children laughing in chambers where the weight of stone could not crush joy. The underground cities remind us that even in confinement, life continues. Even in exile, community can thrive. Their lesson is deeply relevant for the modern age. Humanity faces its own crises: climate instability, war, mass displacement. The temptation is often to see such challenges as unprecedented. Yet Cappadocia teaches otherwise. Across history, survival has always demanded humility and resilience. It is not the strongest who endure, but the most adaptable. And often, endurance has required sacrifice, a willingness to live differently, to give up the comfort of the open sky in exchange for the assurance of another dawn. Philosophically, the underground cities also speak to the nature of memory. History is often celebrated in the grand and the visible: pyramids rising to the heavens, cathedrals stretching toward God, palaces gleaming under the sun. But Cappadocia's enduring monuments lie hidden in the earth, unseen until uncovered. This inversion challenges us to reconsider what we value. Perhaps the truest legacies are not those designed to impress, but those designed to protect, to preserve life in silence rather than proclaim power in stone. In this sense, Cappadocia is both reminder and warning. It reminds us that endurance is possible even under extreme duress, that human beings can carve survival out of impossibility. Yet it also warns that civilizations are fragile, that the need for such refuges arose from violence and instability above. The underground cities endure not as triumphs of dominance, but as whispers of vulnerability, testimonies to what must be done when survival itself is at stake. And yet, from that vulnerability comes hope. The people of Cappadocia did not surrender to destruction. They dug, carved, adapted, endured. Their legacy is not one of defeat, but of quiet victory, the kind that allows a culture to pass through centuries of fire and still leave behind songs, art, and memory. As we walk again into the light after exploring those subterranean corridors, blinking at the brilliance of the Anatolian sun, we carry with us the deepest lesson of all, that beneath the earth lies not only stone, but story. The underground cities of Cappadocia are more than archaeological wonders. They are metaphors for humanity itself. For within every person and every culture, there are hidden chambers of strength, waiting to be discovered when the world above becomes too harsh. Cappadocia's cities whisper still. Their echo is one of survival, of resilience, of the unyielding determination to live. And in that whisper lies a call to us all. When darkness presses in, remember that we, too, can carve new paths through stone and find light even underground.